get a good feeling.
Brings it up. Heisman moving. Blue line checks. Tomas rolls in. He scores! What a goal! Metro! He saw Carey Price and then the bar. Are you kidding me?
You must be kidding me.
Did you just do that, Alexander Barkov?
What a stop by Lundqvist! What a goal!
It doesn't get any better than this.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Hockey Podcast, the second year of our draft strategy episode. Kind of similar a little bit to last year.
We're going to go
over... is it third year of draft strategy?
Could be.
It might be. It could be. So we're going to go over 4 specific categories this year in the draft strategy episode. We're going to go over pick order. So how to handle different pick orders depending on where you fall. Which one do you want in terms of what are you banking on? How did different pick orders affect how you draft later? Then we're also going to go into just goalie strategy because this year it's a really interesting year for goaltenders. So we'll go over what goaltenders should you be eyeing potentially? What's your goaltender strategy this year? Should you mix high volume with high volume, low volume with low volume, that kind of thing? We'll also get into value drafting, which is the idea of using the ADP to draft good players as late as you possibly can and just kind of reading the draft beforehand. And then lastly, we're going to get into the strategy for categories leagues, which are very different from points leagues, and how to kind of structure your team as you go through the draft. And before we get into the episode, just want to mention, firstly, if you're thinking of joining in a listener league, the deadline is September 20th. So be sure to become a patron by then. You can find the link to Patreon on our website, fantasyhockeypodcast.com. So be sure to go there and join Patreon if you're thinking of joining a listener league with us. We'll be in every single league this year. And then the other thing to mention really quick is we get questions a lot that are like, okay, well, if I can't, join Patreon this year, how can I help you guys out? And hands down, the number one way to help out the podcast is by leaving us a review if you like it. It really, really helps us out, whether you're listening on iTunes or Podbean or wherever you're listening to us. A review really, really does go a long way. So without further ado, let's jump into the draft strategy episode and try to tackle some of these really hard-hitting questions. Okay, so let's first jump into picking order for this year to start off kind of draft strategy. So when it comes to picking order, I feel like this year there's a pretty big difference compared to other years between, like, let's say the first 4 picks, those middle picks, and then drafting at the end. So I think it's worth kind of jumping into what's the strategy or what have we seen in mocks depending on where you go in the draft. So I think it's fair to start first with those first 4 picks because I feel like it's consensus. There's a top 4 this year. You know exactly who to take there. And in that top 4, obviously in that first bit, you're taking the best available players. But what about after that? How do you, like, for example, for you, say you're taking one of those top 4. How do you change your strategy now going into the next part of the draft, knowing that you have an elite player?
So if I'm getting... So before we kind of get past what those top 4 are, in case there's any confusion, it's Kucherov, McDavid, McKinnon, and Ovechkin. Those are the top 4 in pretty much any league, especially if you count hits. If you don't count hits, still probably is those 4. But if I have one of those guys, I feel a little bit more opened up about what I'm going to do with my next 2 picks. I don't know that I would change all that much about how I would address my next couple of picks if I get one of these elite guys, but it just makes me more comfortable. The biggest thing that I'm worried about is drafting 5th. That is, in my opinion, the worst possible spot you can get this season is 5th. And that's because, like we said, there's a consensus top 4, and then there's like a lot of people or a lot of players that can, technically wind up being 5th. I think Patrick Kane is Yahoo's 5th ranked guy right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you think about last season, he was like an auto draft for a lot of people in like mid seconds. So maybe even later. I remember in our league, a guy auto drafted him, managed to miss his pick, and was very upset that he went with Patrick Kane. Of course, that didn't hurt too much, did it? But so having one of those top 4 picks, I actually think that picking 4th might be one of the best possible this season, because then you'll be the quickest to turn around to your next pick from the beginning of the pack there. So you'll be able to get a really strong 2nd round pick. And we've talked a little bit we'll go into more about value drafting, but a guy like Hall is probably going to be available, who should was a first round pick last season and, played that well, except for the injury. So there's a lot of interesting options that are available in the second and third rounds. And if you get one of the first 4 picks, I don't know, getting 4th is probably the best, I think, depending on how deep your league is.
I'd agree. And I think it also one thing that happens with those elite guys, especially when you look at it from a category standpoint, is it just sets you up so well. But I think that the thing to be cognizant of when you're drafting from the front, and especially, I mean, this happens really, I see it a lot in the front and kind of middle positions of drafts, is where people kind of forget about the fact that usually those top, let's say, 6 or so, or let's say you're in a 12 person, I'd say that the first 8 positions or something like that usually will just get the best player on the board and not really think about, okay, well, how am I building my team, or kind of my composition for my team. We'll go into it more in category strategy, but a lot of times, sometimes what you see when people draft from those first few spots is that they forget that a lot of times guys like Kucherov or McDavid or even McKinnon to an extent are very heavily indexed in certain areas, which leaves you a little bit weaker in others. Obviously, Ovechkin not being the case there, but you see the same thing with Crosby or even Patrick Kane to an extent where you're really heavy on points. And a lot of times people will kind of get lulled into a sense of complacency where you think, oh, well, I've got my guy. Like, I'm in a super good spot. I'm ahead of everybody. But sometimes it actually puts you at a little bit of a disadvantage because you're making up kind of ground in terms of setting up your team. You shouldn't. You actually are drafting from a position of strength, but oftentimes I'll see people kind of forget about the fact that you've got to be balanced out. You don't want to be too heavy in one area. And sometimes drafting from the back actually helps certain people simply because you're at a disadvantage. And so from the very get-go, they're thinking about team composition and how are they being a more balanced team. And so I think that that's the one thing that definitely changes from the front, is that when you're thinking about drafting those first 4 players in that second round, as you get deeper, quite oftentimes you will be very heavy in like either the points department or very heavy in shots and that kind of thing. And you really got to think at some point, okay, how am I kind of structuring my team? And so you may be looking, for example, so you get like a McDavid. Well, now you should be targeting guys like Landeskog, targeting guys like Jamie Benn, just guys that will kind of round you out if you're in a bangers league. If you're in a points league, completely different. Obviously, you're in a massive position of strength. But if you're in a league that counts things that are more than just points and more than just shots, then at that point, you've really got to take into account the fact that those guys at the beginning of drafts usually are very over-indexed in certain areas and leave you weaker at others. Just because a player is necessarily, a top 5 doesn't mean they can actually weaken you in a certain aspect. And I think that's the most important thing from a pick order standpoint. So let's move on. Before we do the middle part, which you were saying is the 5th spot is the worst, and I totally agree. I think that deserves some conversation later. Let's talk about drafting at the end in pick order, because I think there's some interesting tactics this year to the end. I actually think that although 5th is the worst and 4th is probably the best, I think that this year there's actually a lot of value to be had in drafting in those last spots.
Yep.
And I have a few reasons for that. I think one is that this year there's a lot of value. There's a ton of depth, especially at forward, and it gives you a position to start to see how the draft is unfolding. And I've always said before that I love watching a draft unfold while also having a position of making a draft go in a certain direction, right? So say you're in the 12th spot, right? And you decide to go goalie defenseman early, which is sometimes viewed as insane, but I'll get into why that may be an interesting strategy this year in a little bit. But say you're in that, you can do that, right? Well, now in that next round, you may actually be able to influence people to take some defensemen or take some goalies. And you now have an elite goaltender, an elite defenseman, and you're going to get a pretty decent forward at the turnaround. Just because people are going to see, oh, well, goalies are going off the board, and you can start to dictate the pace of the draft a little bit. And that usually works mostly if you know the people you're drafting with. If you don't know the people you're drafting with, that gets a little bit harder. But really what I like to do from the 12th or 11th or 10th position in those areas is I like to be a little bit risky in who I take and try to dictate the pace of the draft while also being reactionary. So if at the beginning you see, let's say you're in a crazy league, right, where in the second or third round you're seeing a ton of goalies, a ton of defensemen go. Well, at that point, if you're towards the end, you also have the position of strength where you get to draft kind of on the turn. So you can get a forward and take advantage of everyone that's clearly been fading forwards. You can also still get a good defenseman or a good goalie and potentially continue to dictate the draft, continues to go defenseman or goaltender, right? Because a lot of people do look at that end of the draft as to what they're going to do in that next round.
Yep.
So you hold a lot of power. And this year especially, that's really valuable because when you look at, for example, the goaltender position, there's a massive fall off between, say, the top 3, top 4, and then the next tier.
Yeah.
There's a big fall off between those guys. So there is actually this year, I think, some value in getting those guys. And there's a lot of depth at center. You're looking at guys like Larkin and Eichel going way too late. Eichel, of course, Larkin going way later than Eichel is. But you see guys like Backstrom and whatnot. So you can get a lot of value at the end in centers. And then the same thing for defensemen, I think, this year. There's a lot of depth, but there's a clear kind of drop off between point getting defensemen at the top and then your peripheral defenseman at the bottom in terms of Risto and whatnot. Like you're looking at Carlson, John Carlson, Eric Carlson, Brent Burns, Morgan Riley's going really late. But you can get elite positions at the top, dictate the draft a little bit, and then still make up later, which is in the past is what's been hard, is that that gap hasn't been that huge. And so you would be at a disadvantage drafter from the back simply because it was so hard to make up that gap of that disadvantage. But I think this year there's actually a lot of opportunity to make up that disadvantage.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about pick order, the more I'm thinking about it, I might reiterate and think that third is probably the best. And that's just because I think if you're a good drafter, being close to an end cap is beneficial. So yes. I think there's probably discussion about this. I'm sure not everybody would agree with this take, but drafting in the middle, yes, it'll give you consistent picks. Like you're never going to be more than 12 or whatever picks away from your next pick, 12 to 15 picks away from your next one. But and on the end cap, you're going to be essentially 20 or away or so. But when you're on an end cap, once you're drafting and you've got maybe a gap or something that you want to fill, you get 2 chances to fill it essentially. So if you're like, all right, I'm down on hits, you can get somebody like Tarasenko who gets some hits and then also back it up with maybe a defenseman or something else to fill the hole even more. There's like positives and negatives with that, I guess, but because of course you're going to get quote unquote sniped a little more often because there's so many picks ahead of your next one. So you have to have a lot more players in mind, and you need to be like able to make 2 picks back to back without totally tripping over your own feet when you pick your first one. So you do need to be more aware of what's going on in the draft because there's going to be more asked of you. Essentially, you're going to need to be able to turn around your next pick quickly without panicking and auto drafting or drafting somebody ahead of time or whatever. But I really do like the idea of being able to take 2 players really quickly and address problems. Because as you're paying attention to the draft, you're going to probably 4 or 5 picks ahead of you. You're going to have a pretty good idea who your 2 picks are going to be, and with that, you're going to be able to take, let's say, a defenseman and a goalie, right? Like you said, you'll be able to address 2 problems at the same time without worrying too much about a bunch of guys get taken in between your 2 picks. So it's an interesting kind of concept. Whereas when you're drafting in the middle, let's say you need a defenseman and a goalie, and all of a sudden defensemen and goalies are all running off at the same time. You basically have to pick which one you need to go with first. Do you take the goalie first or the defenseman first? And I don't know. It's not, maybe it's not that big of a deal. You can win a league by drafting 6th, of course. It's just, in my opinion, like anywhere between 4th and 8th are usually not places I want to be so much. But obviously this season with the top 4 being established, 4th is fine. But yeah, between 5th and 7th, I really don't want to be there. I would trade down from 7th for free to be somewhere lower.
The funny thing is, I think that drafting from those middle, 5 to 7 positions, the thing I like the least is that, like I've been saying, the idea of being able to dictate a draft or be reactionary, I think that's where you're most reactionary. In those 5 to 7 spots, you are largely reactionary because you're at the mercy of what the ends do. Yep. And you have to, you can to an extent dictate, but you just can't because you don't have that many picks. When you have 1 pick and then your next pick isn't for another 10 picks or so, you don't dictate as much. You don't give off as much of your strategy, that's the plus side of drafting in the middle. The only plus side I can think of is that your strategy is not as clear as everybody else's. When you're watching people from the end, you can to an extent think you know what they're doing. You can kind of propose to guess because they have more positions filled already and everything. So you can start to kind of see what they're doing. From the middle, it's not so obvious. You always kind of think, and if you think back to drafts that you've done, usually you never look at the people in the middle and think, oh, this person's, going to ruin the draft for me or something like that. Usually the people from the middle, you're just like, oh, well, they're just drafting what they need. Like you don't really pay attention much to what's happening in that middle part. You always pay attention to what's happening at the ends. So you can get away with quite a bit in the middle, but that also lessens your impact on the draft. It means you can't dictate the pace as much or dictate what positions are going. So largely you are reactionary. You can get ahead of the curve. And so you can kind of start to see what the two ends are doing, maybe what pace they're trying to set and try to get ahead of that. But largely you're going to be reactionary. And so I think that when you get those positions in the middle, that's your game plan, is be the best reactionary person possible. So if you start to see goalies go, you do have the opportunity to get, let's say, a third best goaltender or something like that. But of course, you're also on the flip side of that, potentially going to be getting a worse goaltender if you decide to pass. And that's what makes it so hard, is if you decide to pass there, you don't get as quick of an opportunity to make up that hole, like Brandon was saying. When you're at the ends, even if you're third, even if you're, ninth in a 12-person draft, you can still make up. Let's say you draft ninth, you decide, you know what, I'm going to fade goaltenders, and you go defenseman, and then the 2-3 people after you then take 2 goaltenders, 3 goaltenders, whatever. You can be like, okay, you know what, actually, I need to take goaltender here, and you make that up pretty quick. From the middle, that's a lot harder, and that's where you've got to. That's where it makes it hard to draft. Is you need to make the right decisions on that first pick every single time.
Yeah. So back to my previous comment, I was thinking about it. I don't want people to think that I meant that as I would trade 7th for 10th and just leave it at that. I meant I would swap positions for the entire draft, right? I don't mean trade down your first round pick. Please don't do that. I mean, like, I would rather draft 10th for the entire draft than draft 7th for the entire draft.
Yes. And I think that when you're drafting from that, so I think this year, in terms of what I'm viewing from a pick order standpoint, I'd like the ends a ton. I think that's kind of like my consensus on that, is the ends make a lot of sense this year. And on top of that, I think that this year is definitely a year where you can dictate the draft quite a bit. I think because of the kind of fall off on talent in different positions, you can dictate it quite a bit. We've seen this in mocks where, a defenseman goes and all of a sudden a ton of defensemen start to go. Same thing with goaltenders. You see a goaltender go and you see a lot go. Although with goaltenders, it's a little bit different, because what you see is kind of, let's say a Vasilevsky goes, you immediately see the Bobrovskys, the Bishops, kind of that next tier, that high tier of goaltenders go. And then after that, you see kind of a big lull between that next set of goaltenders. So in my opinion, this year with goaltenders, regardless of your kind of position, you got to make a decision whether you want an elite goaltender or whether you want kind of that next tier of goaltender. If you want that next tier of goaltender, you can wait quite a bit. If you want the elite goaltender, you're going to have to get them kind of early. And so that's a decision you got to make early on. At the beginning of the year, when we started all our episodes, I actually, both of us had said, this is a year you can wait on goaltenders. And now that I've been doing mocks and kind of really taking a look at projections, I'm not sure if that's my full take.
Yeah.
I think my new take this year, and this is kind of for defensemen as well, to be honest, is that I think it might make sense, especially if you're at the end of the draft, to get an elite D and an elite goaltender early and then take advantage of forwards that fall, especially in a bangers league, just because there's so much value this year in forwards at the end. And the way I've seen mocks go, it's very easy. I found it very easy to get into goaltender trouble. I found it very easy to get into defense trouble. And defensemen this year, I feel like there's a lot to pick from. You have Chabot, you have Pulak. Like, there's a lot of options this year. There's Doughty. It's just that all those options that seem good are so risky.
Yeah, low floors.
So you can end up with a defense that on paper looks good, but the floor is so low and it's so risky that I'm not sure if that's a good idea. And so, interestingly, different from past years, this year, the mocks I've been most happy with are the ones where I take a defenseman or a goaltender early and then kind of focus on my forwards later, which in past years, I've always hated when I do that because my team just ends up not being that strong at forward. But I found a ton of value this year from taking a goaltender or a forward or a defenseman early and having elite players there and then kind of making up later. And this kind of goes back to, I think, one thing we've talked about in the past in last year's episode of this is, and Brandon, you speak to this better than me, but is that idea of the difference between picking in those first few rounds versus rounds later in terms of you're trying to address your floor and your ceiling, right? And throughout the whole draft, kind of our thing is, and we talked about this a little bit on the Keeping Karlsson episode, is the idea of trying to raise your floor. Like in the draft, you're going to be dropping players. It's just how it is. You will be picking up players. And so in my opinion, especially in those first 5 rounds, 6 rounds, you want the highest floor possible.
Yep. I would say even the first like 8 rounds, maybe even 9. Like I don't really want to take big risks unless the upside is like enormous, like a line A, right? Like downside was obviously 50 points or so, but the upside is enormous. So like he kind of falls out of that. Like I wouldn't take him before the 8th round range, but a lot of other players that I feel like I just don't know yet. I'm probably waiting till that 7th to 8th round. Speaking to the mock strategy slightly that we've seen, I definitely agree about elite defensemen. I still think you can wait a little longer than, I mean, again, the draft kind of dictates this, but it seems like that first elite tier of goalies go. And then there's, like you said, a bit of a break. And then you get that second tier, which is going to involve a lot of very good goalies, your Gibsons, your Murrays, your Jones, your whatever. So, and those guys seem to be going somewhere around the 5th and 6th round, which is a little later than they usually do. So I am agreeing with the defenseman idea because I've had the same as you. I've run into defenseman trouble a lot in these mock drafts. But I think that might speak to how Yahoo's kind of standard setup goes. It's I really don't like their standard kind of positions, but well, that's another discussion. But because of that, I do like the idea of getting some rock solid guy early on for defense, and then probably another mid tier guy, and then you can start gambling or using peripheral guys for your last 2 or 3 or whatever you need.
Yeah, especially when you look at guys like, for example, I think in the mock that I did that I really liked, I got Brent Burns early. And then I think I took Erik Karlsson after that, and I had that stack. Or I don't remember exactly, but I know I kind of went defenseman heavy at the beginning. I still ended up with guys like Larkin, ended up with Eichel. You can still get really good forwards, and then later on I still got Pulock, I still got Gostisbehere. So like you're talking about a really good floor defense with also a very high ceiling defense, and that's kind of what I want this year on D, because there is very good ceiling guys and very good kind of risk guys in Gostisbehere, Pulock, even Dahlin. I know Dahlin, of course, you know, we talk about him he's great, but from a ceiling standpoint or floor standpoint, sorry, it's not that high, given if Risto is still there. Just right. Because you never know if he slows down, if second year rookie, just whatever. Like you never know, right? It's still a little bit of a risk, and that's what I want to avoid. But at the end later in the draft, there's just so many defensemen late that have really high ceilings that those are the guys I want to target. But I think if I'm using 2 roster spots on elite defenseman and then 2 roster spots on high ceiling defenseman, if it's a 4 defenseman league, I'm feeling really, really good about how my team is shaped up. And then just to go back on that goalie bit, I agree with you that I think it's worth waiting, but I think at the end of the turn, if say Vasilevsky's there, I'm not against taking Vasilevsky this year.
Yeah, yep. I agree with you there.
Right? Like I think that if I have Vasi at the end and I can get him on that turn, I don't completely hate it. And I've seen a lot of people do that at the end of the draft, and I actually kind of like it. He's just so much better than every other goaltender and so much more safe than any other goaltender, as safe as you can get for goaltenders, that it just feels like a really, really solid pick when you look at Bishop going just a few picks after him.
Or ahead for some reason.
Or ahead. So, to me, Vasilevsky, like a Vasilevsky and elite defense tandem at the beginning, you're set up so well in a position that is so scarce this year in terms of like elite players. And the thing too that I like about taking a goaltender early this year in terms of Vasilevsky or Bobrovsky, for example, is just that they're going to get so much volume. And as so many articles have come out in the past few weeks that volume is getting scarcer and scarcer for goaltenders. It's just this new thing in the NHL that they're trying to get players rest. And so volume is getting scarce, and especially on really good teams, it's getting pretty scarce, even when you look at like a Grubauer. So getting a guy like Vasilevsky or Bobrovsky early, you guarantee starts. You guarantee a pretty good save percentage on most nights. And the reason that I like volume on goaltenders is simply because you can make up a bad start because they're going to get 3 more, or whatever in the week. And so you have that opportunity to kind of get back to average. And then that allows you to then later get like a Gibson, or even if you want to wait even later, you can get like a Murray or whatever. You can get another goaltender later that kind of even increases that floor even more. And you don't necessarily need to worry too much about starts or wins because you kind of already have the goaltender for that. And so that's kind of my take on that. Is I don't think I'd reach for a Bishop. Even Bobrovsky is a little bit of a question mark for me. I know I've said it, he's a top 3, but I don't know if he's as safe as Vasilevsky is. But to me, like my ideal, I think this year, for example, I'm going last in one of my points leagues. My plan is pretty much to do that. I think if Vasilevsky falls to me, I will take Vasilevsky because I'm at the end of the draft in 12th person. I will take Vasilevsky and then a defenseman and then wait out on forwards till the next round.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that Vasilevsky is clearly like the top guy that you'd take. He's got there's a couple of reasons for it, right? We talked about volume. Why is he gonna have volume? I would say it's because there's not a great backup like Louis Domingue. Like or I guess did they pick up Hutchinson?
McElhinney.
It's McElhinney. It's Toronto that got Hutchinson, right? I can't remember. So McElhinney's actually a better backup. So this is a little bit not as good as it was when they had Domingue, but they're going to want to play him because the backup is not quite as good as like kind of relative backups elsewhere in the league. McElhinney is actually a bit of an upgrade, but I still think they're going to rely pretty heavily on Vasilevsky, especially considering how young he is. So that's the kind of golden ratio, I guess, is very good numbers from a standpoint of save percentage and goal against average, while also getting a lot of volume. So kind of like Martin Jones, except not bad. Would be like if Martin Jones was actually a good goaltender, he'd be amazing.
Yes.
But even though that he's like I know last year he was awful. He's not that bad. Honestly, he's not that bad. He's like an average, like run of the mill vanilla goalie.
But see, that's what's interesting this year about taking a goaltender early is that you could get a Vasilevsky or a Bobrovsky or whatever early, and then really, really late you can get a Martin Jones, and no one will ever beat you in wins. Vasilevsky is good enough to keep you up in save percentage. You would expect Martin Jones to be better this year. And you now got a great tandem. And that's kind of what, I think with goaltenders this year, what I'm seeing is that there's value at the end. There's risk at the end. It's similar to defensemen. There's risk at the end with very low floors, but you can make up for that by having elite talent up front.
Yeah. So there's an interesting, an interesting goalie kind of strategy that I've tried to pull off a couple times, but you really need to have the right draft going for it to work. But there's the idea of taking low volume guys that probably get very good stats. So the idea of pairing up somebody like Ranta with somebody like Varlamov could be pretty interesting. You get both of them really late. You're going to lose wins every week, but the odds of you getting pretty good save percentage and pretty decent goal against average are relatively high because that's how those teams play. And because of the lack of starts, you'll be able to get them like very late. So it's an interesting option. It's going to be hard to pull off. And if you miss it, you could be in big trouble. So There's that. But I do like kind of pairing if I'm going to have a low volume guy, I wouldn't mind just getting another one, especially if you have a 3-start minimum. If you have a 4-start minimum, then I don't know. I don't think a lot of people do that other than our league because we got tired of people only running one goalie. But I do like the idea of pairing volume with volume and lack of volume with lack of volume and not trying to like hedge your bets and wind up with an average.
Yep. It's kind of like understand where you're at from a goaltender standpoint, right? Yep. If you've got volume, then why not go after another volume guy like Quick or Jones, where you have the wins, or Dubnyk, exactly. Like you have the wins kind of secured if you can get a Bobrovsky, or honestly, like another guy we haven't talked about is Frederik Andersen.
Yep.
But he gets faded super hard all the time. I think for whatever reason, people kind of forget that he's actually really good. And there's a little bit of recency bias going on there with Frederik Andersen, where he sucked at the end of last year and tanked during the playoffs. Although so did Vasilevsky, and I mean fantasy playoffs, not real playoffs. But that holds some recency bias. But nonetheless, I think if you can get one of those guys early, you're looking like you're in pretty good shape to draft a goaltender later, and you can fade them a lot harder when people need to start taking goaltenders. I think that this might be one of the, I don't want to say one of the worst years, but it's definitely not an ideal year to get goaltenders in the middle, it feels like. Kind of like, the whole strategy that everyone says, oh, we'll wait till the middle and you'll be fine for goaltenders. I don't know. I agree that you'll be fine, but I don't think you maximize draft value from a goaltender this year by drafting in the middle.
It depends
just
on
because there's so
how
much
the draft is kind of dictating itself, as always, right? Like all this comes with a big asterisk. It's all about you could wind up two rounds into your draft and all the goalies are gone and everything we've told you is out the window.
Here's kind of what I'm looking at, right? Like in a bangers league, for example, when you look at what's happening in the 5th, 6th rounds, so that's when most people are starting to take their goalies, right? But in a bangers league, that's also when you're starting to see the Evander Kanes go, and those kind of bangers go that also give you insane coverage and kind of fill you out in certain positions, and then you're still seeing Larkins available and whatnot. And so to me, that's where I see, from a value standpoint, in terms of goaltenders, why would I want to take a goaltender around the 5th there when top 10 players are going around that area, right? I'd rather take a goaltender early, kind of secure that. Same with defense, secure that, and then have those middle rounds to start to kind of snipe players that are falling because other people need to start taking goaltenders and defensemen. And that's what we've really seen in the mocks. And I think the thing that gets hard is that once you get to those points too, is then you get into a real troublesome issue where you're deciding, do I take a goaltender? Do I take a defenseman? Or do I just keep grabbing the best forward out there? And, what's happened to us in some mocks is it's hard to say no to taking the best forward out there, but you end up in some real big defenseman and goaltender issue. And for me, the way to solve that is to just get it out of the way early. I've taken centers really early, and I found myself at the end of the draft being like, that sucks. I wish I would have waited because there's a guy who's ranked, 5 spots below him still available. And that's kind of, I think, where goaltenders this year, for the first time, I can't believe I'm saying it, but I do think there's value to taking goaltenders early this year and kind of being early in on the goalie run. Yeah.
I still don't think I would do it before round 3 unless I got Vasilevsky. I feel like round 3, if I was drafting late, like if I got, an early round pick, that would be where I would target an elite goalie if they're still around. But
yes,
if you think, I assume Bob is probably going to wind up going in the seconds. I don't know. It's going to depend on the draft, but that's where I'd be like, all right, I'm trying to get somebody in the 3rd or 4th round. Probably for me, 4th or 5th, maybe. It depends. It all depends. I would love to get a goaltender in the 5th. I feel like, but again, you might, if you're in a bangers league, especially if you have PIMs, you might miss Evander Kane if you do that, who's a great option at 5th if you can get him. It all depends. But to kind of go back a little bit to the point of pairing guys with similar volume, if somehow you get Bishop, honestly, you shouldn't be getting Bishop unless he fell really far somehow. But let's say you have Bishop. There's a bunch of guys you could pair with a guy like Bishop. I think Carter Hart would be a nice kind of pairing with him because I don't think I'd expect him to get 60 plus, but I expect his numbers to be pretty decent. And I think Markstrom could be a decent pair for him. I think the guys we already mentioned with Ronta and Varlamov could be decent pairs. And it's just whoever falls a little further than you expect, I guess, and is still around and has good upside, I think would be who I'd target. But and then on the volume side, obviously Marc-Andre Fleury and these guys that just don't have the best backups, right? Jones, he doesn't have a great backup. I think it's still Aaron Dell over there, right? And he's just not great.
He's whatever.
Hellebuck, I think, has fallen quite a bit further than I'd expect this season so far. I mean, he's got Brossoit behind him, but he still plays a ton for some reason.
Yeah, to me this year, okay, so here's a quick glance at like Yahoo ADP. Vasilevsky's going 9-2. So that's kind of what I'm saying. If he falls to 11th to you, or even if you're in the 9th position, I think 9th position makes sense for Vasilevsky, honestly, this year. That's fine. Ben Bishop is 13.2. Don't want him there.
Nope.
Sergei Bobrovsky's going 19.5, which is solid. Like if you're, so this is where, like I'm saying, taking him early. If you're in those first 4 spots, right, that's where kind of 19.5 would fit in on the turn. If you are on the turn and Bobrovsky's there, and say you've already gotten a Kucherov, you've gotten Ovechkin or something like that, I'm not against taking Bob there. I'm just kind of shoring up your goaltending early because you already have such an elite forward. And like we've said, there's so much depth at forward.
Where's Anderson going?
Totally against.
That's the question to me.
Freddie is going 37.7, which is
I would much
really
rather have
value.
Anderson at 37.7 than Bob at 19.
Agreed. But, I think that the thing with Yahoo's ADP, it's tough, I think, in real drafts to assume that someone like Freddie falls that far. I think that the top goalies, you can usually assume the ADP is somewhat right for almost every league. It's really those like 37.7s, the 41s, that kind of stuff. Usually I find that they tend to go higher in real leagues than they do in the mock drafts. Because in a mock draft, I feel like everyone says, "Oh, I won't fall in the mock draft to the perils of the goaltender, rally or whenever the goaltenders start going." And then when the real draft happens, like, "Oh my God, I gotta get a goaltender! Go, go, go!" And so it's like, I think you always kind of push those guys up a little bit. But if you look at, for example, right now using the tool, I have, I want to actually kind of walk through what, the rankings relative to ADP are if you put in wins, goals against average, and save percentage. So let's look at just averages for a second, right? So Vasilevsky, Bobrovsky, and Bishop are 1, 2, 3. Makes sense for an averages league. And so that's kind of, Bob is 2, Vasilevsky is 1. Freddie actually is 11th. But then you're looking at a guy like Rene, who's 5th. You have John Gibson 4th. John Gibson is an awesome pairing with, like, if you have Vasilevsky, for example, and Gibson, you're not losing.
Yeah.
But then you still have guys like Dubnyk and Grubauer who are big sleepers, and Ranta is also a great average player. Of course, there's the injury risk, but that's okay. But those guys you can get later in like the 70s. So Dubnyk and Grubauer are both going like in the 70s. So to me, my ideal draft for goaltenders this year, I think, personally, in like at least an averages league. If you're in a points league, it's a little bit different. And points, in my opinion, are a little bit more straightforward, just because it's, you have the points to dictate who's going to contribute the most. But I think ideally for me this year, I'm personally targeting kind of a top goaltender early. So you're looking at a Vasilevsky, a Bobrovsky, and Anderson, one of those guys. And then I want to wait until around the 7th, 6th, somewhere around there, to then get a Devin Dubnyk, Philip Dubnyk, you can probably wait a little bit longer, but a Dubnyk, a Grubauer, or a Carter Hart, which I think will fall quite a bit more than their ADP suggests.
I feel like I'd wait longer for my second goalie, just because I get that that forwards are super deep this season, but I would even I would be heavier on defense than I would for my second goalie. I always feel like every season there's going to be somewhere between 3 and 5 goalies that are going to pop out of nowhere. Like we had Kemper, Binnington, I guess Hart, right? Last season, among others. That sort of came to life pretty quickly. Riddick, I guess, was another one. Koskinen for like a minute. So there'll be options, but
yeah. I mean, Ranta's going 108.7, which is great value.
Yeah.
So that's, for example, if you get a goalie early, I would happily wait until, Antti Ranta goes. And Ranta in some of our some of our mock drafts, he's gone way later than 108. I've seen him go close to the last round of the draft, and that's incredible value. So, there's a lot of, I think this year there's a lot of value to shoring up these scarce positions early, and then moving into kind of your forwards.
So when we're talking about this concept of value drafting, which is the idea of making sure, it's pretty straightforward, right? You're making sure you get good value at every single draft position every time you make a pick, that the value is optimal. To briefly to tie it back into goalies a little bit, when you have a points league, it's really, really tough to get goaltender points and skater points like copacetic. Usually you're either going to have over-indexed goalies or under-indexed goalies, and you need to really take a good look at how your league is breaking out, if it's a points league, on how you're going to draft your goalie for fair value. With a Cats league, it's a little easier. You know that if you have 3 goalie Cats and 7 skater Cats, or 6 skater Cats, which is fairly similar to normal, or if you have the Yahoo standard of 6 skater Cats, I think maybe it's 7, and 4 goalie Cats with shutouts being in there for a bad reason, then it's a little bit easier to know that your goalies are going to count for specific categories, and it's binary, right? You're either going to win or lose those categories. So you can have a little bit more of an easier time drafting them. But with points, if your goalies are over-indexed, then you need to figure out why, right? If wins are very valuable, then you need to be early in on guys like Jones, guys like Vasilevsky is the obvious answer, but high volume guys on decent teams, even if they don't have the best stats. Jones is like the guy you can point to so easily for this. Especially if I think it was ESPN or one of these, it may have been Yahoo, I can't remember. I think it was ESPN, that its standard points category was just wins for goalies, just wins. So like Martin Jones is probably a top 3 or 5 goalie last season because of that. Yep. So yeah, this is just a little aside before we really get into value drafting about how this breaks down for skaters versus goaltenders, and how it's not exactly the easiest thing in the world to get that correct. But, and maybe you don't want it correct. Maybe you intentionally are overvaluing skaters or goalies or whatever, but it's just be aware when you're joining a points league to look at the points before the draft.
I mean, even a Cats league, I think we run into this all the time where people will post, even if you post, let's say, a question to our Discord or something with a trade or something like that, it always shocks me that the first thing that they don't think of is what are the Cats?
Yep.
Because even when you're posting a question, like to me, my questions are always formulated around how does it affect my categories or how does it affect my points? The style of your league is so vitally important, right? And we see people make this mistake a lot where, of course, right now, if you've been paying attention to fantasy hockey for a while, you know this, but for people that are just getting into it, which I know we have some listeners that are kind of newer to fantasy hockey, is the biggest thing is that don't take rankings, for example, from NHL.com or different places and just apply them across the board. It's super important to look at it from your league's perspective, and especially if you want to win. Like, one of the number one ways to win your league, and this sounds so stupid, but it's so true, is literally just know your league inside and out. Know your settings. It's shocking to me how many times we'll get questions or just people kind of reaching out and they don't fully understand how to take advantage of their league settings. And that's the biggest thing. And especially if you're drafting with just coworkers or more like, casual people and you just really want to beat them. That's the number one way to beat them, is just understand your league settings in and out and really know how it works. For example, like Brandon was saying, Martin Jones is such a perfect example this year. Tons of recency bias. Everyone is fading him hard. He's getting bad rankings all over the place. But if you're in a league that counts wins almost pretty much exclusively, he is going to be perhaps a top 3 goaltender. And you should know that. And you should be ready to capitalize on that. And it's the same thing, for example, with Evander Kane in Bangers leagues. If you're in a Bangers league, Evander Kane gets infinitely more valuable just because his ADP is 80 or whatever, or he's going his ranking is lower. Doesn't matter. His actual value changes, and so that kind of gets into the actual value drafting strategy and the way that I like to think about value drafting. And I think the basic way to put it, and hopefully this isn't confusing, I know sometimes it is, to me, value drafting is essentially just maximizing value at each individual position that you draft. And not positions in terms of center, left wing, right wing, but just when you're at the first spot, when you're in the first round, second round, third round, how do you maximize that value? And I think the best example to give is, say that you have a guy like Evander Kane, right? That is ranked. You put in your projections into the tool we built, and you sorted the projections, and you see that Evander Kane is 5th overall. Does that mean you should take Evander Kane 5th overall? No, of course not. The way to do that smartly is through value drafting. What you do is you take into account ADP, where is it going at, and also just who are you drafting with and how is the draft flowing, and you try to get him at the lowest point possible. And in that way, you are now getting a top 5 player at the latest possible position, which just gives you more leverage. That means you now have gotten 5 players before him that are also very, very good, while also adding a top 5 player later.
So there's something interesting to be said
it's important
about, and this is not exactly value drafting. It's more like how can you can use like being social to win you leagues. It's weird that I feel like this is something that's not discussed at all. If you literally know from like a personal standpoint the people you're playing with, you can play way better. It's in your best interest to make friends with people. As weird as that sounds, like talk hockey, be active, and like learn from what people, especially before the draft. That way, especially if they are outspoken on social media about players, you can get an idea of like who they have their eye on, like early on. Like, we're already doing this. We have I'm sure some of them will be listening to this episode, but we have a draft coming up. Actually, they won't be, because this is going to come out after the draft. So we have a draft tomorrow with a lot of the fantasy hockey people on Twitter. And we've noticed just from the way a few of them, like the directions they tweet, right? Like the people that they focus on. Like if somebody talks a lot about Darnell Nurse, you have a pretty good idea that they're going to be at least having their eye on guys that have good banger stats. So those are the players that I'm like, okay, I need to watch these 3 guys or whatever, because they talk a lot about peripherals and about whatever, and then you see other people that talk a lot about upside and youth and all this stuff, then I'm honestly a little less worried, because I'm thinking they might gamble early. So it's all these types of things that you can use to be like, okay, the 5th round has begun. Am I actually going to get the player I think I'm going to get, or can I wait even? This is what you can use to figure out if other guys in your league are kind of on the same wavelength or what they might be thinking. It's that
and that
simple,
gets
really.
back to kind of the ADP part, right? Where like when you're looking at the ADP, I personally, when I draft, I rank by ADP actually, and so I'll rank by ADP and try to follow. Because what's funny is, we get things all the time where it's like, well, ADP doesn't matter to me because my league doesn't use ADP. That's fine. And look, that makes sense. But let's say you're in a bangers league, then take bangers, add let's say 20 ADP positions to them, and now you get a pretty good sense of where they're going to go. Just add the value that they'd inherently get in their league based on how different your categories are, whatever, right? But what's funny is ADP is wisdom of the crowd. And so the thing that I find, and I've always found, is that people subconsciously, whether they like it or not, tend to follow ADP in some regard.
Yeah,
maybe
the
not
guys are in your face all
perfectly.
the time because they're at the top of the list.
They may not perfectly follow ADP, but it gives you a pretty good idea of how the draft is going to go. And so ADP is not perfect. Don't use it as a ranking system. Use it as a measuring stick. Just use it as where could guys potentially go? Where should I be thinking of getting them? And another thing that I always like to do is I actually like to subtract their ADP from their actual rank once you have rankings for your league, and just find what the difference is. And players that have a bigger difference, well, those are guys you can kind of reach for a little bit. People that have, a negative difference, well, those guys I don't actually want to reach for. And those guys actually are going below value. And so that's what you're trying to look for. You're just trying to get guys as close to their ADP as possible and maximize, your top 10 players or whatever however you want to view it, right? But you just want to get the best players possible at the latest position possible.
Yep. And also when players, and it'll always happen, right? Players will always fall past their ADP. The other part of it has to do with, when do you take these guys that are falling? I feel like a lot of times guys start falling, especially in Yahoo standard leagues, due to their position. Like we talked ad infinitum at this point about how centers are really deep, and with Yahoo's standard, you know what? I'll do it now. I'll talk about why I don't like Yahoo's standard positions. You only get 2 centers and you have no flexibility spot. So centers are really, really, really deep. For this to be even, you'd expect, and I get that there's more wingers on paper than there are centers, but a lot of wingers, if they are dual eligible, or center dual eligible. So it's hard to compare a left wing depth to a center depth. It's not close. So it makes it annoying because you see really, really good centers either not drafted or drafted extremely late. Again, we're seeing Ryan O'Reilly go really late, but it's because there's so many other centers. There's just so many. So
you're also seeing guys like Braden Point even fall.
Yeah. And I feel like the 2 that we see fall the most are Evgeny Kuznetsov and Nicholas Backstrom, both on the Capitals for some reason. Kuznetsov being the better option, but I think his ADP is something like 65-ish, but you think about a couple years ago, he was 2nd or 3rd round pick. I think that might have been last year even. And he's not like he fell off or anything. So it's just a matter of, and I think he's going to fall from that number, honestly. Just from what I've seen from mocks, he's going way later than that even, because people will get there. You have all these high tier centers that are available. Everybody you got Tavares and Matthews. So you got 2 top tier centers on one team. You got 2 top tier centers on another team with Crosby and Malkin. And then you've got a ton of great value guys like Ryan O'Reilly, Dylan Larkin. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. And because of that, you see these who should be elite centermen fall really far. So if you're using Yahoo standard positions, the idea of not taking a center early, even if it makes sense, is kind of a good option. You can wind up getting Kuznetsov in the 8th round or something ridiculous. And you look at your team and you're super balanced.
You're looking at Zibanejad going 78.5 in a bangers league this year. That's just insane to me. Zibanejad should be going way higher. He's, to me, a top 30 player in bangers leagues this year, most likely. And that's, so like you said, I think the most interesting thing this year is that I found myself, taking guys like Eichel early and whatnot. And even with Eichel, I find myself later saying, damn, I kind of wish I would have used that to take a defenseman.
Yeah.
Or I kind of wish I would have used that to take a winger. And it is really true this year. There's just so many centers late that are falling just way too far. And granted, there's not a comparison, I think, for example, between Eichel and like say Ryan O'Reilly. There's a big fall off there. But I think when you're looking at like
5-round difference or something.
Yeah. I mean, if I were comparing, let's say Eichel and Larkin though, they're not that far off in my opinion.
Yeah.
At least in a bangers league, they really aren't that crazily far off. And even Ryan O'Reilly is not that far off. And you got guys like Sean Couturier going later. It's just
every year
thing. It's clear the centers are being faded. I mean, Dylan Larkin's ADP people. I know this is a little bit of a preview of the sleeper episode. Dylan Larkin is 132.1.
Yep.
I mean, come on.
That is ridiculous.
That's insane to me. He's going after Jack Hughes. Come on.
The thing that I think that would help though is if you're going to use or at least start with the Yahoo standard positions, I would add at least one utility spot or one generic forward spot.
Yeah. But but here's the thing that's interesting is this is the thing that gets into value drafting. That's the most important, right? You look at a guy like Dylan Larkin and you say, and I know I kind of talked about this a little bit, but just to make sure it kind of hits home is you look at a guy like Dylan Larkin, who you're saying is, or even Jonathan Toews, who is also going super late, right? You look at those two guys and just because they are going too late doesn't mean you reach, you like jump 10 rounds to grab them. That's not how it works. That means you look at them and you say, holy crap, I can get a really, really good team before I finally get those guys. And then once you've got a really secure team and you feel really good about where you're at, then yeah, maybe reach 3 rounds or something for them and shock everybody with the snipe. But there's no reason to just reach in the second round for like a Dylan Larkin when you can get him later.
Right.
And that's really the whole key to value drafting is just if you can get a guy later or you feel pretty comfortable that you can get a guy later, then it's worth it to wait. Even if you don't get him, it's still worth it to wait simply because you will get more value across the board by waiting.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the whole key to the whole thing is knowing your draft well enough. And ADP is a big part of this, especially if you don't know who you're drafting with, to know when you can make that reach and how far it needs to be made. So the more we've played with the same players as is expected, some of our strategies are starting to be found out, and some of these sleepers become less sleepy and start being taken earlier. And then you wind up with, once you start getting something closer to what you might think is fair value, then it becomes really interesting when you have to draft them. But especially in random leagues or in leagues where there's not a lot of communication to begin with, or you haven't mocked with them or whatever, then you gotta have to follow how the league is going and take the guy a little ahead of what his ADP is, depending on how the draft is shaking out. Another good thing you can do is especially when you get down to like the 8th, 9th round, start looking at other people's teams. If people have their center spots filled out, you don't really need to take a center very early. You can wait even longer. And that's going to be very common. You're going to see a lot of teams, especially, if you're picking in 4 picks and you're thinking, oh, should I take a winger or a center? And you look at the guys in front of you and you see they're all full on centers, you're pretty much guaranteed that, or not guaranteed, but you're much more likely that whatever center you're thinking about is still going to be there when it comes around. Then you can make the decision more easily. You don't have to think about them as much. But that's paying attention to other teams and seeing where they're filling up will help you a lot in terms of knowing what positions you need to start panicking on.
And lastly here, moving into cats strategy, categories, cats, same thing. It's very, very different from a points league. So in a points league, for the most part, you're just kind of, inputting your points and it spits out how many points a person is projected to get. And largely, you can take what we say about value drafting and kind of scarcity of position to that same extent, but largely you're just taking the best player from a points projection standpoint. A categories league gets a little bit different. It's not so simple to just say take the best player on the board every time, because once you start getting to the 5th, 6th rounds, the most important part in a categories league is that you don't want to be too over-indexed in one area. At the end of the draft, you want to be balanced. That being said, it's worth talking about kind of when certain categories go. Because, for example, it's impossible to leave power play points to the end. There is just not that many players at the end of a draft that get you power play points like the ones at the beginning of the draft. So Whereas hits, for example, or PIMs are easier to get later in the draft. But that's where multi-cat monsters come into play in the middle of the draft, towards the beginning of the draft, that become more valuable because they just cover so many categories. But okay, that's a quick overview. But let's talk about first just a cat strategy at the beginning of the draft. So how do you kind of navigate that part of the draft, and what categories are you focusing on the most? Let's pretend this is a bangers categories league, just because there's more categories involved. Of course, apply this depending on your league.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to think about when you're drafting a team in general is that, to your point, you don't want to be over indexing anything, right? You want to be the ideal, and I mentioned this last season if you listen to the draft strategy episode, which is probably pretty similar to this one. You want to be beating everybody by a little bit in every category. You want to be as best you can, right? If you have a ton of categories, you're probably gonna have to punt something if you really want to pull this off. But the idea is, if you're crushing people in, I don't know, hits and PIMs, but you're losing in shots and blocks, let's say all these categories, then you're going to chop those and you're going to be up to points. And I don't think I would want to do that. The idea would be that you want to be close on everything. You want to be beating most teams in PIMs, beating most teams in hits, beating most teams in shots. There are going to be teams that are going to beat you in every one of those categories throughout the season. But if you're beating them in the other categories, then it doesn't matter. So when you talk about how do you handle this early in the draft, I think usually my first maybe 2 or 3 picks, unless there's something crazy going on, I don't worry too much about getting multi-cat guys. Your first pick, like we already mentioned, power play points are pretty much the hardest thing to get. So if you get a high point guy with a lot of power play points, Kucherov is the obvious example here. You're going to feel pretty good about stuff. Now, the one very glaring kind of exception to this rule is Ovechkin, right? And that's because he's a point per game player that also gets you every category. So he's just incredible for banger leagues, because he's I don't think there's anybody else in the league that'll get you 80 points and 200 plus hits and 300 shots and whatever other stupid stuff that Ovechkin does. So it makes him, and at left wing, right? So it makes him super valuable. But as you get throughout the draft, I think like when I really start looking at, okay, I want to get my first big category guy, is usually around somewhere between the 4th and 6th round. It could be Dustin Byfuglien if you're a risk taker at this point. Evander Kane is kind of the premier multi-cat monster. As he is going to get you, he's going to near 100 PIMs. He's going to get you a ton of hits, a ton of shots, and he's going to get you okay points. I still think he has a point upside that we haven't seen yet, but you're not really getting him for his points. Obviously, you want some. You don't want him to go sub 50, but he's pretty consistent as far as getting 50 something. And that's where you want him. I think another thing to consider is if there's these peripheral categories can be a tiebreaker. So when you're thinking Pastrnak versus Marchand is a good example. From a points perspective, I expect them to be somewhat close by the end of the season, but Marchand gets so many PIMs. And PIMs, yes, they're easy to get if you're willing to take a guy that only gets you PIMs, but they're hard to get if you want to have a balanced team. So yeah, you can add somebody like Borietsky, Ryan Reeves, right? On certain weeks to kind of fill that out. But if you need to fill that out and another position, like what does Reeves get you? He gets you PIMs and hits and nothing else. Like he's gonna hurt you in shots. He's gonna hurt you in points. And that's kind of the downside of streaming guys that get you straight up peripherals that are straight up banger peripherals anyway. So it's yeah, you got to be careful when you're going for that strategy of trying to make it up during the season.
Yeah, it's really just being cognizant of it, to be honest, because when you look at it, and also I should have mentioned that when you're at the beginning of the draft too, that's also why sometimes I've said in the past, McDavid is overrated or whatever. And this is where it kind of gets into the conversation, is that it's not so much that McDavid is literally overrated. It's just that he doesn't cover a lot of peripherals. And so the whole consensus number one thing is always been weird to me, because you look at a guy like Ovechkin, and to me, in a bangers league, to me, Ovechkin is still a number one overall. No one gives you the coverage he does. He sets you up so well for the rest of the draft, gives you coverage in the hardest to find places. And that's why he's so valuable, is because he fills out all these categories. But like you said, I think that at the beginning of the draft, I don't necessarily look for multi-cat monsters, but if they're there, I do give them a little bit extra weight. For example, Ovechkin does get a little bit extra weight for me.
Yeah, for sure.
As does obviously a guy like Kucherov, right? And that does factor in. I think towards the middle of the draft is where you start kind of paying attention to, okay, who do I need? So for example, here's the way I see it is, let's say you're lacking in PIMs or you're lacking in hits or you're lacking in assists, for example, right? The way I like to look at it towards the middle of the draft is, okay, who's a guy who gets me a lot of power play points or is indexed well in power play points, but also gets very good of this X thing I need? Or who gets power play points and then gets me, a good mix of this and this. That's kind of how I look at it. Is more later on I look at it as a blend. Obviously, you take into account kind of their overall rank, but more than anything, what later you've got to take a look at aside from their overall rank is, do they give me this kind of cat? To me, power play points also another thing from a category standpoint. I know I'm kind of all over the place, but another thing it kind of does is, if you look at power play points, it's the one that kind of predicts, I'd say, the most upside.
Yeah.
If someone is getting a lot of power play points, there's a lot of upside there. There's potential for the power play to do really well. It also means good 5-on-5 time. That's, to me, those are the players that have the most points upside. So I like looking at power play points as a kind of upside marker, if you will.
Yep.
And so that's really my main kind of thing is, okay, do they get good power play points? And then do they also fill out a category I need?
Yep.
But that to me is the most important thing with categories drafting is that idea of filling out those other stats. And the thing that is nice is that if you're smart about it, and I know I've seen a lot of people, there's different strategies. You can go really, really points heavy at the beginning and kind of fade all your peripherals and get peripherals later through defensemen or through a Ryan Reeves type. Or my preferred option is more of fill out those, Ryan Reeves types and whatnot in the middle of the draft. And then once you get to the end, you can take flyers on upside points, guys. The problem is if you leave peripherals to the very, very end, there's two issues, in my opinion. One is you don't get the opportunity to take flyers. It's not as easy to take flyers on high upside guys such as Jack Hughes or other people who may be falling. And so I never have liked that option. It also gives you much less flexibility when it comes to free agency. It's harder to drop those top guys, but you also don't have as much flexibility in who you can drop to pick up flyers. And then the other thing that it does on top of that is sometimes you actually get into the problem of starts. So if you have a bench and you waited until the very end to, let's say, add a Gudas to your bench or add a Reeves to your bench, well, now you're also in a little bit of a pickle because now you've got to start someone. You've got to start Ryan Reeves or Gudas or whoever over somebody, which may put you in a little bit of a problem in a certain week. And so for me, I like to be pretty balanced throughout my starting roster, not through my bench. I think that's a really important distinction. I think in a points league, it's a little bit different. I like to be strong all the way through. In a Cats league, I pay very much attention to how strong am I on my starting roster specifically, just because you can never guarantee necessarily that you'll be able to bring in a Ryan Reeves over whoever the hell is your last forward or whatever, if you don't count positions, right? And so to me, the starting positions are the most important in a categories league. And then the bench for me is upside, filling small holes, and also giving room for potentially needing to drop people if you've got to pick people up to stream. Because in categories league, streaming is insanely important. Not that it's not in a points league, but in a categories league, you usually stream with the idea of stealing a specific category.
Yeah. One of the things that I definitely think about when I'm in Cats leagues is I don't want somebody that will be a liability in any position or in any category. So you think about guys like Backstrom, who's a good example. He doesn't get you a lot besides points. I don't like that at all in a bangers league. You need them the number I like to see is 3 shots per game. That's the pace that I think is like, okay, this guy's a shooter and he's going to help me. So once you start falling below 3 shots a game, if a guy doesn't get 200 shots in a season, I'm not picking him in the first 8 rounds or so. I just want all my guys to be able to take shots, and then anything else I do beyond that is kind of extra. So I definitely don't want guys that take no hits. So Phil Kessel becomes he's like an example of a guy that he has a lot of value because of power play points, although on Arizona, who knows, but because he doesn't hit, he falls a bit for me. And when I say he doesn't hit, I mean he does not hit. He got like 7 hits or something last season. So that if you take a Phil Kessel type, you have to be very aware of what you're doing, because the next thing you need to do is, or not, maybe not the next thing, but you have to make up hits big time, because a lot of players are going to get you somewhere in the 40s of hits, and those add up. When somebody gets you 7, it's a detriment, and it's going to be an issue later on. So I do like a guy that I like when you talk about bangers leagues this season is Svechnikov. He's a high upside guy that's going to get you shots and hits, and the odds of him getting a higher ice time, which will increase all of these peripherals that he already gets, is pretty high this season. So he's an interesting option for Cats leagues, and a good explanation of what I mean when I say a guy that's going to get you sort of extra.
Yeah, and he's a good one of those guys that I was saying also that's a great example of someone that is a great bench filler and also could fit into your roster. He's going 149th right now. He's similar to Brady Tkachuk in high upside, may have a low floor in points, but the rest of the peripherals are so good. That's the kind of guy you like to take a flyer on in the Cats League and reach a little bit for, just because they fill out the stats that you need, will get you decent points, and then on top of that, also have a very high ceiling. And so that's a good example, I think. Svechnikov, Brady Tkachuk, those are great guys that I'd say you can get them on your starting roster or on your bench, but towards the end is a great place to get them.
Right. I feel like for some reason it seems like PIM, like when leagues have PIMs in it, it seems like it's almost ignored by a lot of people. Like they might pick up again, they might at the end of the draft realize I have no PIM guys and grab a Wayne Simmons or a whoever, a Ryan Reeves or a whatever. But PIM's going to be a pretty, like Marchand is a great example, can be a really good kind of boost, because they're hard to find except for in specific like meatheads or Tom Wilson, I guess. But them being a kind of tie break when you have close guys, two close players, is a pretty interesting option to utilize, I think.
Yep. And that also goes back, I think, when you look at Cats leagues that count lucky stats like shutouts and game-winning goals and plus minus and whatnot, I personally scrap them. I don't mind. They're such lucky stats. You can't predict whether you're going to win week in, week out with those. I completely scrap in my projections. I do not draft using like a plus minus. Do not use shutouts.
You shouldn't have plus minus at this point. It's such a bad stat.
Yeah. But it's a standard in Yahoo.
And ESPN, I think.
And ESPN, I think. So to me, I think that another thing is you can find pretty good value, and it's smart from a category standpoint to scrap the ones that are going to hurt your player. If someone contributes well to your categories, especially across, let's say 3 or 4 categories, but they're so bad in plus minus that they drop, 20, 30 points in rankings, that sucks. And that's not, to me, worth it. Like, I don't think plus minus should hold that much weight. I think plus minus is such a lucky random cat week to week that you're fine scrapping it. You're probably going to come out equally ahead or below than if you actually, planned for it. Okay, and there you go. That is the draft strategy episode. Of course, if you have any questions or want to follow up or want advice specific to your league, be sure to join our Discord. We're in there constantly kind of answering questions and fielding any topics that you guys want to talk about. You can find that on our website, fantasyhockeypodcast.com. And of course, another reminder that the deadline to enter our listener leagues is, September 20th, I believe we said,
yep.
Right?
September 20th.
September 20th is the deadline to enter the listener league. So be sure if you're thinking about joining those, get in those soon. You can do that by becoming a Patreon. You can also find our Patreon link by going to fantasyhockeypodcast.com as well. But just remember that September 20th is the deadline for the end there. And we will also be releasing swag very, very soon. We have scarves and toques or beanies in America coming out really soon. So keep your eyes out for those. And thank you for listening. Next up is the kind of sleepers, busts, and all that kind of, good draft stuff coming out soon.
Yep. And one other shill, please leave a review if we've been helpful for you. We really appreciate it, and it helps us out a lot more than you think. So thanks for that, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Fantasy Hockey Podcast, brought to you by myself and my co-host, Brandon Stockenborg. If you liked this episode or others, please leave us a review. It's the #1 way to help the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @FantasyHockeyPD, join our Fantasy Hockey Discord channel, play in a listener league with us by becoming a patron, and check out all our tools on fantasyhockeypodcast.com. All research courtesy of Dauber, Daily Faceoff, Hockey Reference, Hockey Viz, Natural Stat Trick, Evolving Hockey, and RotoWire. Intro song is by Avicii, and the outro is by Deadmau5. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.